Hey guys, I'm Dr. Steve Silvestro, pediatrician and host of the Child Repair Guide podcast. And this is the conversation you've been waiting for. I have been asked for years to talk about nutrition and developing healthy eating habits in kids on the Child Repair Guide podcast. And I am very glad that I have waited so long because today I'm very excited to share with you the amazing insights of Jennifer Anderson. If you are a parent on Instagram, you probably know Jennifer as Kids Eat in Color, where she helps her over 1 million followers develop healthy eating habits in their kids and get them to try new foods without a battle. Jennifer is a dietitian and holds a Master's of Science in Public Health in International Health and Human Nutrition from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Plus, she's a mom, so she knows all about the challenges of feeding young kids firsthand. Guys, this is a fun, wide-ranging interview. We talk about everything from getting kids to try new foods without battles, the one-bite rule, what a healthy approach to a meal looks like, snacking tips and concerns, the importance of eating variety and how to get your kids to actually eat that variety, what to do if your child doesn't sit still for a meal. We cover how to talk about nutrition in a way that doesn't risk developing problems down the road. And of course, picky eating. Now, there was a fun moment in this episode where there was a violin lesson in the background of our conversation, and I've left that in because these days we are all used to the craziness of things popping up in real life. But there was a moment where that violin lesson turned into a piano lesson, and so you will see a quick edit that I've made where Jennifer is then suddenly wearing headphones. This was an insightful, engaging conversation that I found to be one of my favorites in the 4 years of the Child Repair Guide podcast, and I hope that you enjoy it and get as much out of it as I did. So let's get to it. Welcome back, everybody, to the Child Repair Guide. I'm Dr. Steve Silvestro, and my guest today is Jennifer Anderson, the dietitian and mom who has been helping families around the world develop healthy eating habits in their kids and feel good about themselves as they do it, all through her wildly successful Instagram, Kids Eat in Color. I am personally a huge fan of yours. My wife, Monica, who's a preschool teacher and used to work in nutrition, is also a big fan, and she wanted to make sure that I said that to you in person. So I'm really glad that you're here. Thanks for being on the show, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's so great to be here.
Yeah. Now, in addition to all the amazing Instagram content, I want to make the plug that you also have the Real Easy Weekdays meal plan and Better Bites online program on your website, which I want to talk about, a little bit later on. But just to start, how did you begin doing what you're doing right now? What was the origin story of Kids Eat in Color?
Yeah. So, if we want to go back to the real origin, it was when I was sitting in the pediatrician's office and the pediatrician was telling me that my first child, who was 9 months old at the time, was not gaining weight appropriately. And at that moment, I thought, wow, feeding kids is hard because I'm a dietitian, but kids don't care that I'm a dietitian. My kids don't care that, right? Yeah. So I began to specialize in child feeding and helping my son learn to eat the right amount for his body. And then my second child tends to be selective. And so all of the work that I did with my first child, I've had to double down on with my second so that they can both eat a wide variety of foods. And there was a point at which I was standing in my kitchen, I was making this cute little lunch to entice my child to eat food at preschool. And I thought to myself, I can't be the only mom struggling right now. I can't be the only mom thinking this is really hard. And that was in the fall. And in January of the following year, I started Kids Eat in Color.
Yeah, you're right. That's absolutely a common experience. We actually had the same with ours. I have a almost 13-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son. And my daughter did not gain an ounce between 12 and 18 months.
Oh, so hard.
Right. And
the pediatrician's breathing down your back,
Yeah. And here I am. I guess by that point I was in the final months of my pediatric residency.
Mm-hmm.
And all you learn really before you have your own kids when you're being trained as a pediatrician is all the stuff that goes wrong. You
Right.
know, you don't really learn about all the normal variants.
Right.
So yeah. Um, Actually, let's talk about growth charts for a minute, because I know that you have some feelings about them, and I kind of hate them in a sense as a pediatrician. Everybody really is focused on those numbers. And
Right.
now that it's electronic, I can tell you to the hundredth of a percent of your percentile. Um, what's your thought on growth charts as a
So
measurement?
here's my thought. I'm trained as a public health professional and I'm also a registered dietitian. And growth charts are so helpful for describing what's happening in the population. They're so helpful for describing things on the wide range. And I do think they're helpful for pediatricians to give you a sense of what's going on. Because when you see a wild variance, when you see the kid's been more or less tracking, and as parents, we think, oh, they have to stay on the line, but that's ridiculous, right? As professionals, we know people are all up and down over time, but they're generally following a curve. But when all of a sudden we see them shoot up 50 percentiles or they drop 25 percentiles, it's a great opportunity to start asking questions.
Yeah.
What is happening? What is going on? Was there stress in the family? Was there an illness? Is there something going on? Is there something going on metabolically or genetically or, those sorts of things? So I love growth charts in that sense. But what I don't like is I don't think parents understand that not everybody is supposed to be at the 50th percentile.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It's
that
just
95 doesn't mean you're winning, you know?
Yeah, like people come in all different shapes and sizes. Everything on that growth chart can be healthy.
Yeah.
And then I am a little upset with the CDC cutoffs for obesity, where there's I feel like they're kind of beating it into the heads of the pediatricians. Like, if it's 85 percentile or more, you have to say something. And so I get these poor parents. Pediatricians are shaming kids right in front of them. They're saying things like, you need to go on a diet. There was a pediatrician recently, 11-year-old kid with autism. The pediatrician said, I don't want you to go see a dietitian. I don't think that would help. But the keto diet really helped me. So mom, I
Oh,
want you to put
goodness.
your 11-year-old on a keto diet with autism. So we're seeing pediatricians right in front of the kid recommending diets just because of this number, where some kids, they have always been 95th percentile. From the time they were born, from 3 months old, 95th percentile, they can be healthy at that weight and height because that's
Yeah.
where their genetics are at. They're just a larger person. And same with smaller kids. But we have to help them as professionals understand what they're seeing and say, okay, yeah, your child used to be 50th percentile. Now we're seeing that at 95th percentile, rather than jumping and saying, oh, you need to put your child on a diet, which is not an evidence-based recommendation in the least. Using that as an opportunity to ask questions. So tell me, what is going on at mealtime? What's going on at home? What's going on with your child?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know this wouldn't be a shock to you to hear, but if I'm not mistaken, trying to remember back to medical school, which was a while back now, I think that we had a month of nutrition,
Yeah.
and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I actually couldn't tell you a single thing that I remember from that month, because there wasn't anything that was a standout. And it
Right.
wasn't necessarily how to address any particular problems. It was more just that this is what you need, and these are possible sources of these nutrients, and that's about
Right.
it. Yeah.
And how are you supposed to address nutrition in a 15-minute visit with a
Yeah.
child? I mean, I just feel like that's not fair to you and the doctors who are trying to get involved and say, okay, mom, you need to put or dad, you need to put your child on a diet. I just feel they're speaking outside their scope. If they're making that recommendation to a child, they don't understand even the AAP recommendations on not talking to kids about diets. They're just kind of influenced by diet culture, and they're using
Yeah.
that to talk about kids. And I just find that so frustrating, because you look at so many eating disorders begin with a diet. You mess up their relationship with food. The parents start pressuring the kids, which reduces their ability to learn to like new foods. It's just a complete mess. So I really want pediatricians to do the right thing, which is, wow, I see this. Tell me more. Let me refer you to a dietitian who can actually get into this with you, because it's complicated. You can't just fix an eating problem with a 2-second conversation.
No. And then say, come back in 3 months.
Right.
Which is what we do.
Right.
I mean, I'm being honest, right? Because we don't have that training or that time, and it's a real shame. You touched on something I thought of asking a little bit later, but I think it's probably the perfect time, is how then do we have conversations with kids? And it might be useful to break it down into different ages, because I think that I hope that we're all, at least as parents, if not also as professionals, worried about talking about these things in such a way that we create more problems with eating than there already are. And yet at the same time, we want to make sure that kids are brought up with this understanding that food has a massive impact on everything in your life. So how do we talk about food and health, especially in a kid that probably needs to make some changes?
Sure. So I always like to, there's a couple issues here. I think on one hand, we're kind of talking or dancing around the topic of childhood overweight. And then we're also kind of talking about how do we help kids learn to eat healthfully, which I think are two different issues. And I can kind of explain that. But I think when we're talking about kids, we really need to meet them where they're at developmentally. And with preschoolers, I like to start with just the basic connection. Food does something in our body. We're not going to vilify food. We're not going to say anything bad about food. We're not going to start causing shame and guilt in our 2, 3, 4-year-olds by saying, oh, that food is bad for you, so we only need it sometimes. The problem is candy tastes really good. Yeah. So every time we say candy is bad for you, they automatically start learning, oh, wow, candy is bad and tastes good. So bad foods must taste good. Oh my gosh. The people above me appear to have started a violin lesson.
It's perfect. I don't have to add any music to the background now.
Oh my gosh. I don't know where this is going. So I guess I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay.
We're all used to now from working from home and kids around that anything goes, right? I
think I need to find out their schedule. Okay, so that's preschool. Then as the kid gets older, you can start to actually help them understand what the connection is. Like elementary school, this food does these specific things in your body. For preschoolers, I like to break it down to color. Red foods help your heart. Purple foods help your brain. Really basic statements. And then as they get older, we talk more in depth. My son came home and he said, so-and-so said chocolate is bad for me because it has sugar. It's like, well, that's interesting. Yeah, it has sugar, but let's talk about what else chocolate does in your body. And so we learned a little bit about chocolate. We learned about some of the phytonutrients in it. We learned all sorts of things. And I said, some things do a lot of things in our body and some things do a few things in our body. Candy just has sugar, but chocolate has sugar and all these other things. So at that age, I like to focus on some foods do a lot of things and some foods do a few things. And we're still not vilifying anything, because the reality is kids aren't not going to like candy. Yeah. They're just going to develop complexes around eating it. It's not like kids are going to stop eating candy. I just don't think that's reasonable or healthy or anything. We want them to be able to enjoy candy when they eat it, but also to enjoy all these other foods. And so when we set it up by saying, well, some foods do a lot and some foods do a little, and then we model balance in what we serve, I think that's where the powerful combo is. Yeah. And then down the line, we can talk more about food companies and how they try to influence our eating in ways that aren't necessarily helpful and things like that, and kind of engage teens in the rebellion of, protecting ourselves and things like that, rather than saying food is bad for you, because we know there's a whole literature on saying when you tell people something is bad for them, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm there for it.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe let's start with a broad framework, what would you say a healthy approach to eating looks like to you?
Sure. So I think, trying to add fruits and veggies to every meal and snack is a good place to start. Eating a variety of foods. I think variety is really where the key is. I'm also big on including potato chips in my diet because I enjoy them a lot. But I think that is balanced by the fact that sometimes we eat broccoli for breakfast. I think variety, the more colors, the more of those things we can include. And of course, the less processed foods we include, if we're able to, the more that we learn to eat what our body needs and be less influenced by the fast food and the highly processed foods and the cookies and candies and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that you said that because, like I said, I'm a pediatrician. My wife did work in nutrition for a while. Before that, she used to work in public health on actually teaching kids, creating curricula about understanding how diet and nutrition and food messages are portrayed in the media and marketing and really cool stuff.
Well, that's awesome.
We had nachos for dinner last night. Now we had kale chips and we had this big old thing of sauteed mixed veggies with it, but smack in the middle of the plate was nachos. And my daughter had the leftovers today for lunch, but 2 days ago she had a smoothie that she made herself. Had lentil sloppy joes the other night, right? But last night was nachos.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. And what that teaches kids is we can live. We can eat things we enjoy. We can enjoy a smoothie that can be fun and delicious and nourishing to us. And nachos with a family together can also be wonderful and delicious and nourishing us to us as well. And that's honestly, I think that's more important than somehow creating some perfect diet, because the more we have preschoolers going to school telling their little friends, your mom is feeding you poison because they saw a cookie in that person's lunch. When we focus so much on the perfect diet or the best diet or only whole foods or whatever you want to call it, what happens is those kids become little vessels of judgment and guilt among their friends and then among other parents. And I don't want that for my kids. I want my kids to go out and say, yeah, let's have some chocolate together. Let's enjoy it. Do you want to come to my house? We also have some broccoli on the table. It doesn't have to be a thing unless we make it a thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned a moment ago about trying to work fruits and veggies into meals. I think that one thing that I encounter with parents, especially when they first start off feeding solids and then into the toddler period, some parents wonder as if things need to be very regimented. Exactly how much is the serving size? What do I need in a breakfast and a lunch and a snack?
Right.
Is there a general layout that you would say? I say layout because so many of the things that you share are these beautifully sculpted pictures. What sort of approach should a parent use to a meal or a snack in terms of what to include?
Sure. So first, I always like to assure parents that kids eat a variety of amounts on any given day. Yeah. It's actually not our job to make sure they eat 1 teaspoon or 2 tablespoons or 5 tablespoons. That's not our job. It's not our job to decide what actually they swallow. That's their job. And when we give them that ability to listen to their body and to give them space to decide how much to eat, that's how they learn to listen to their internal cues and listen to when they're hungry and full. And the more that we can protect that, the better off they'll be in terms of eating the right amount of food for their body. And then as far as a layout, when I come to a meal, I like to think, is there protein food on that plate? Is there some sort of color? So a fruit or a veggie. And the reason why I do think it's important to try to include fruits and veggies at all meals and snacks, especially with the babies and toddlers, is because those have the vitamin C that can help them absorb iron and that sort of thing. And it's just a great exposure tool. So if you can get into that habit and always providing a protein food and always providing a fat source, I find all the other things, the carbohydrates and the whole grains, those tend to fall into place as long as you're focusing on that protein food and that color, and then making sure there's some fat there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, partly one of the things that it might drive a lot of folks towards what you do. I notice a lot of the questions that I get revolve around this feeling that kids are picky eaters.
Mm.
Um, I know that I certainly see natural waves. I describe kids in the second year as like little teenagers. They want to be in charge and independent. And so your kid who was an amazing eater at 12 months may not be at 15 months because it's the only thing they have any control over.
Mhm.
But, there's this, and some kids are truly a lot more selective, but how would you define picky eating versus a normal variation, normal kid behavior?
Sure. That's a great question because there's so much debate in the research literature on the
Yeah.
actual definition of a picky eater. So I think it's a little bit subjective. What also happens, like you described that 15-month period, what happens at that time is they're really developing that developmental step of being afraid of new things.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can become afraid of new food. So food neophobia begins to appear, usually roughly 12 months to 24 months. And the child is genuinely afraid of the food. They're suspicious of it. They're afraid. Maybe they think it's disgusting. Maybe they had a bad experience and they don't want that again. There's a lot of fear there. When I talk to parents about picky eating, there's what I call basic picky eating, which is due to a breakdown in what parents should be doing and what kids should be doing.
Hmm.
Is the parent in charge of what's being served? Is the parent in charge of where the food is and when the food is being served? Great. Is the kid in charge of whether they're allowed to eat or whether they're not allowed to eat and how much to eat? Great. But what happens is those often break down and you see parents pressuring their kids choosing the meals, kids saying, I'm not going to eat this. No, mommy. That arrives around 2 and they're saying, I'm not going to eat it. And the parent says, oh no, so I have to make chicken nuggets because that's what you asked for.
Yeah.
That is a huge breakdown and that causes a lot of picky eating. But what we also see is kids where that may be happening, but there's something else. The child's number of foods is decreasing over and over. They're down to less than 20 foods that they'll accept. They're under 30, then they're down to 20. You all of a sudden might see a child who only accepts 5 foods, and they never bring those foods back. Normal variation is a child will, I'm not going to eat apples for a couple days, but then I'm going to add it back in. That's fine.
Yeah.
And that's pretty typical. But what's not typical is for them to say, okay, I'm never, ever going to eat an apple again. And I'm also not going to eat this other list of 30 foods that I used to eat. I'm not going to eat those either. So that's suggestive of something more serious. And then what I also ask parents to consider is how defeated, how frustrating, how out of control does it seem at mealtime? Because what I find is parents who have extremely picky eaters are having a much different experience than kind of typical picky eaters. And when the parents of an extremely selective child is talking to these other parents, they're thinking, oh my gosh, my life is so much worse than whatever they're describing. We're like not on the same plane. And they have this feeling that something is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this sense that even if their child isn't losing weight yet, or even if their child isn't having a medical problem yet, something is off and it feels really bad. And so I bring that into my discussions when I say, okay, do you need help with your picky eater? Sometimes you see kids where the pediatrician says, yeah, this is kind of a problem, so here, just give them some Pediasure. And the parent thinks, I don't think that's the answer here, but there's no medical problem, so they can't get a referral to a dietitian. So that's why I created Better Bites, is for families who are struggling with picky eating. They don't know what to do. They feel like they have a problem. Their child is eating less and less foods, or it's been a long time and they'll never, ever try a new food. That's another sign. Your child just will never try a food. And that program is for those families because they really don't have any other options. They can't go see a dietitian easily. They can't get a referral from their doctor, but they do need some help.
Yeah. Without giving everything away that you would do in a program, what sorts of tips, like what kind of approach could a parent use, at least as a first step?
Sure.
in that
Yeah,
situation?
yeah. So I always recommend as a very first step, taking the pressure off of your child. And that could be anything from, oh, you did such a good job eating your peas. We think of that as praise and a good thing.
Mm.
But for a picky eater, that is like salt on a wound. That is, I'm not going to eat those peas ever again. You want me to eat those peas? No way. You're engaging them in the battle right there. So I encourage taking off all the pressure from eating. Stop pressuring, stop battling, and just take a step back. And then in the Better Bites program, what we do is we go over, okay, what exactly are your jobs as the parent? And we also spend quite a bit of time understanding picky eating because it's complex. It's not just one thing. There's the sensory system, there's what's happening at home, there's the food, there's the child, all the things, right? So we go over that. Then we go over your home feeding environment, what the parents should be doing, what the kids should be doing, how to serve one family meal, what that looks like in a family with picky eaters. And then from there, we go on to how to help your child try a new food using advanced methods that you would get if you worked with a dietitian one-on-one or something like that.
Yeah. So with that division of responsibility, because I talk about that too. I sort of call it the Ellen Sauter approach. I don't know if she came up with it, but that's where I first encountered
She
it.
did. Yeah, she designed it, and she has a very specific form of it. So she calls it the Ellen Sauter division of responsibility. I like to use it generically because I've made a few little tweaks for my program. So I don't want to like co-op.
Copyright.
Yeah.
Yeah. What, and so, to highlight or to explain for folks that may not know it, you sort of touched on this. It's the idea that it is our job as parents to decide what kids can eat and when, and theirs to decide if and how much.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
What would you say? Because I crowdsourced some questions from folks, figuring this would be a very hot topic, and got tons of responses.
Yeah.
And one came up about this approach where a family then would always offer the guaranteed meal or guaranteed component, and then but that was all that their child then wanted. So when that would be done, it wouldn't branch out to the rest like the hope would be,
Right.
and then would fuss or whatever and just demand more.
So here's what I say about that. I always recommend having an unlimited safe food for children because that allows them to feel safe. And anxiety plays such a large role in picky eating, especially extreme picky eating, that we can't afford to have them becoming more anxious and more fearful at a meal. When a child is anxious, they become hypervigilant. When they become hypervigilant, they begin to notice all the details of the food. They become picky, more afraid of the foods, and then they eat less. And as they avoid foods, they become more fearful. And so it just becomes this really unhealthy cycle. So I recommend cutting that cycle off by serving an unlimited amount of safe food. And from there, being able to give them that safety that they need. Now, you can't stop there if you want your child to actually learn to like more foods, right? But that's where we have to start. And that has to take place over a period of time as you're establishing that you're not going to force your child anymore. You're not going to force feed them. You're not going to hold their nose and make them take a bite. You're not going to do any of these things that parents, you're not going to praise them anymore. You're truly going to allow them to choose. There may be a period of time where your child actually stops eating for a couple meals. There may be a time where they even might lose a tiny bit of weight before they re-engage with their own sense of hunger. And then they come back and they are able to eat more. So we have to give them that space where we're providing a safe food for them in as much quantity as they need to fill up on if they want to. And then from there, we have to engage them in food play, in helping them make tiny changes to the foods they'll eat so they learn to like new foods. There's all sorts of things that we can do on the advanced methods side to help a child learn to try new foods in a positive way. But we can't do any of that without the foundation of you don't have to eat it if you don't want to.
Yeah. So you have to feel comfortable with just being there for a meal first. Yeah.
Right.
So, I guess kind of then extending from there, I imagine that it's probably a lot of the same approach with other things that might come up. There's some people asked about kids who won't eat a whole food group. I often see I tell people this is a fake number, but maybe 15% of kids are like meat and potatoes kids. And a lot of kids won't really touch all that much meat until they are elementary school aged. Or some kids who love veggies and won't touch fruit, or vice versa. Would it be the same sort of approach where you are working on just comfortably introducing and exposing and making it okay for them to not eat those while trying to find the nutrients elsewhere?
You do want to make sure you're providing a substitute. For example, if your child isn't eating meat, you want to make sure you're providing eggs and beans and protein foods, dairy, to help them get what they are not getting from not eating meat.
Yeah.
You don't just want to leave them high and dry. You may have an extremely picky eater if, for example, they eat no protein foods whatsoever, and they're actually at risk of a protein deficiency. But most kids will find some other substitute to meet that need.
Yeah.
We just have to, and it's fine. It's fine to let them have their space to learn to like it over a longer term period in a way that's not forcing them or making them dislike the food more.
Yeah. So then I imagine that you're probably not as much of a fan of something like a no thank you bite or a one bite, right?
My husband's heard quite a few rants. Here's my thing. I'm actually, surprisingly, I don't have a strong stance on, quote, one bite rules. The reason is there's different cultures, there's different families who have successfully, almost in a no pressure way, created a culture where everybody tries a food. Actually, in my family, we don't have any rules around it, but I know at any time, even with my selective eater, I could say something like, oh my gosh, this tea is so good. You have to try it. We say this as adults all the time to our friends. It's not that we're forcing you, like I wouldn't be forcing you to try this, but it's just an invitation, right? And my kids 9 times out of 10 will absolutely try it because we've created that culture. Now, other families just have a rule. We all try all the foods and then we make a decision. And that's fine. Other cultures do that as well. The problem with the no thank you bite is we're teaching kids that in order to say no, they have to do something. And I think that's a bad precedent for safety, for eating, for, risky behaviors as they get older. And it just starts a bad circuit. I've worked a little bit with Rebecca Kennedy, who's a psychologist who works with parents, and she agrees that, reinforcing this circuit that in order to say no to something, I actually have to try it is not the circuit that we want to be reinforcing. When our kids are being offered drugs later and their friend says, oh, come on, try it, you'll like it, which is exactly what they heard every day growing up. We don't want them to say, okay, I'll try it. We want them to say, no, I don't want to try it and I don't have to because it's my body, right? We want to encourage this agency over their own body and their own choices. So instead of saying, oh, you have to try that in order to say no, thank you, let's say your family absolutely must have a one bite rule. Okay, I'm not actually going to fight you on that, but don't call it a no, thank you bite. You can just say, in our family, we all try a bite. Okay, but you could also say, you know what? You know your body. You know what your body needs. You can choose to have a bite when you're ready. And instead, you're building that circuit in them where they're looking inside themselves. They're saying, okay, is this something that's going to be good for me? And then they're making a decision. Frankly, that's the circuit. That's the skill that I want to build in my kids long term. And I'm willing to have them have less bites at dinner in the short run now so that they can use that skill long term in the face of risky behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's something that I have noticed. You every now and then do have something that pops up where you have 2 pictures of the same exact food. I think you just had one in the last couple of days too. And then the different ways to talk about kids getting ownership over that meal. Yeah.
Because there's so many things that we can do. We can just make a little tweak. Like I can tell you, Steve, you don't have to eat that broccoli. Or I could also say to you, Steve, or I could also say, Steve, you can try broccoli when you're ready. And that's going to be a totally different experience for you as a person and a totally different experience for me as a parent, just by a couple little changes of words.
I think what is probably it, I think there are probably like two roots of what makes it so hard for a lot of us as parents to do that. And I always say us because I always include myself, because I can have this podcast and be a pediatrician and make all the same mistakes or have the same challenges as anybody else. You know, that's something that you fess up to as well, which I think is great. But I've completely lost the train of thought there. You know, I lost it. Oh well. Well,
so you were asking about the roots of parent concern.
Yeah. Oh yes, thank you for paying attention to what I was trying to say more than I was. I think that there are probably two. That one, there's a lot of pride over what you've made and what you have prepared, right? You've put the effort into it. But then also, you know, this kind of inherent worry that, well, my kid then won't get the things they need. And so it sounds like you just need to be on top of making sure that you've got the variety so that you have safety nets in other places throughout the day.
Yeah. You know, it is hard. And it's hard if I have a child who wasn't eating enough. So I understand how absolutely terrifying it can be to sit at the table and watch your child choose not to eat when you know they're underweight. I remember one conversation my husband said, shouldn't we just tell him that he needs to gain weight, that he needs to gain enough, you know, to eat enough to grow? And I was really leaning back on the research, which has shown if you pressure an underweight kid to eat, they actually eat less. So it's not, we think it will help, but in the long run, it doesn't help. And we disconnect them from the sense of whether they're hungry or full. So an underweight child might become more underweight as a child, and then later in adulthood, they may have even a greater risk of becoming overweight because they've really been taught and trained not to listen to what their body was saying, which happened to be saying, you know, don't eat very much. So I understand it can be hard. And I think that's where sometimes it can be helpful to meet with a dietitian if you have really strong concerns about your child's nutrition, because there are some deficiencies that could result. And if your child is eating absolutely no fruits and vegetables whatsoever, it's quite possible that they're not going to get enough vitamin C unless they're eating fortified foods, in which case that's a great idea to talk to your pediatrician about having a simple multivitamin. You know, I find sometimes, now, not all kids need multivitamins by any means. That said, I do find sometimes it takes the pressure off of parents. Like, they can't not pressure their child. They can't not pressure them. Yeah. But you say, well, why don't you give them this multivitamin? They'll be okay. And then the parent thinks, oh, okay, well, I guess I don't have to pressure them because I know that they're at least going to get the minimum, you know, major nutrients.
Yeah. And that's actually like my approach with multivitamins is because people ask all the time, right? Yeah. And you know, fairly so. Is that ideally you get it all from food, knowing that we all grew up with the food guide pyramid and the percentages on the sides of cereal boxes, and makes it sound like you wake up and calcium resets to 0 and potassium resets to 0, and that's not really true. So if you get a variety over a stretch of time, you're usually good, but if you're not, then the vitamin could be a good safety net.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the ones that have like 1200% of B6 or 800% because it's either water soluble and you pee out the excess, or fat soluble and you get more and more. We can talk about that for a while, probably. I love to really pick your brain on a couple of other things that I know that I get asked about a lot. You know, one just kind of behaviorally is the idea of sitting for a meal. You know, you get tons of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds that don't want to sit, and some parents get frustrated, and some parents chase around the house with a nugget or something to try and get it in. What are your thoughts on that? Is the meal done when a kid gets up? If they get hungry later, do they have to eat the same thing you made, or should they get something different? So many little things to tease out.
It's complicated. And
Yeah.
as to highly energetic boys, I completely understand this dilemma. But you got to come back to this idea that you are the parent and you're in charge of mealtime and you're in charge of where food is served. We're not going to be chasing kids around the house with a fork. It's just not worth it. It's not worth the choking risk. It's not worth the food on your carpet. It's not worth the calories you burn trying to. It's just not worth it. So instead, we have to teach kids to sit at the table. And what I do, and I actually recommended this in my free child feeding guide where I kind of outline this, is teaching kids with a timer how to sit for longer. So starting with 1 minute, 1 to 2 minutes per year of age. That means for a 3-year-old, you would expect them to sit for 3 minutes. Ideally, we want to get them to at least about 15 minutes. But as a parent of 2 kids who couldn't sit for 15 minutes, we got to 12 and we stayed at 12 for about 3 years. And that was good. Ideally, we would get to 15, 20, up to 30 minutes. But if that's not your reality, then that's fine. And so what I do is I recommend starting with a sound timer, telling the child, we're going to sit here for 3 minutes. For a 3-year-old, they usually can sit for 3 minutes. You have the food all ready to go. They sit down, they eat. The timer goes off. You let them get up. Then the next day, you can increase it by 1 minute. And what you're looking for is their maximum capability of sitting. Kind of observe this. How long do they sit and read a book? How long do they sit and color? How long do they sit and do these other things? If it's never more than 8 minutes, chances are your kid isn't going to be able to sit at the dinner table for more than 8 minutes either. So finding the max attention span for your child is important. And then once you find that max attention span, you can get a sand timer where they make these big safety sand timers that have colored sand in them. And then you put that on the table. It's the dinner timer. We have a million of these in our house because they're so helpful. And then you say to the kid, okay, we're going to sit here until all the sand is at the bottom. And then they've been trained using that sound timer to get up to, say, 8 minutes or 12 minutes or 15 or whatever. And then when it's done, they can get down. But it's unreasonable to think that all children are going to be able to sit and pay attention for 30 minutes. I mean, that's just not practical.
Yeah. No. And because we've had X number of decades to try and be socialized into what the mealtime should look like. And that's the aim with raising kids, but it's going to take a long time to get there for some. Right.
Yeah.
I guess kind of as a tangent to us deciding when kids can eat and what, and there's decided if and how much, snacking, I know is often a big question. I know a doctor who grew up in Europe and is just flabbergasted by the idea that kids get snacks at the doctor's office, they get snacks in the car, they get snacks at Target, and this person felt, that there was sort of a regimented order to when you can eat, and that's how kids should be raised. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. We are serving kids food way too much. Kids are grazing. Grazing causes cavities. It causes kids to eat too much for their body. It causes kids to not eat enough for their body. Grazing it's a real problem, and it shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah.
What we're instead of teaching kids to look out the window and imagine something in the car, we're feeding them a granola bar to keep them happy. Instead of, being with them in their tantrums and their fussiness in Target, we're giving them food to eat in Target. Now, I'm definitely not saying you're a bad parent if you've ever done any of those things. Definitely, I feel like I was always grocery shopping at snack time with my kids, and just being in the food aisle, they were like biting into whatever food they could grab. So I started bringing a snack to the store. I mean, there's just some practical aspects of parenting, but we shouldn't be using food in place of our parenting or in place of allowing our child to be a little bit uncomfortable. Hunger is just a sensation. It's not something that we need to respond to right away. It's certainly something that we want to tend to. We need to feed our children reliably and consistently. They need to know when food is coming, but they don't need food all the time. And if your child says, I'm hungry, and it's not snack time, it's perfectly okay. It's safe, and it's good parenting to say, the kitchen is closed right now. We're going to have lunch after nap time.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And yeah, they may throw a tantrum because that's what kids do. Guess what? They also might have thrown the same tantrum if you had fed them a snack, but you fed them the wrong snack.
That's right.
Fed them a banana and the banana broke.
Yep.
There's just no guarantee that you're not going to get a tantrum. But by giving them the power of when to eat, we're really setting them up for poor health. And that is part of our culture that's teaching us, like, we need to be eating all the time and we need to eat whenever we have the slightest bit of hunger. That's really marketing. That's our unhealthy food culture that has taught us that. And instead, we need to step back and say, okay, I'm gonna serve meals and snacks on a schedule or a routine, and I'm gonna do it consistently. And my kid's gonna know when the food is there, but I'm not gonna just be handing out snacks whenever.
Yeah. There's also the risk that then you get just the association of the activity or the place, right? I mean, we actually even had this happen with my kids, where we had a stretch where we were doing some long car rides on vacation, and we'd usually bring snacks. We're going to be in the car for 3 hours to go visit my family. But then it got to be a point where you get in the car, and the moment the door shuts, I'm hungry.
Yeah.
It's like, were you not hungry 5 minutes before when we were actually in the house and the food was here? Because there's no food here right now. The door just shut in the car. Like, this is it. Yeah.
Yeah, my kids, we were just at my parents', and grandma's always spoiling kids, and my mom is no different than that, and she fed them a snack, I think, every time they got in the car for 3.5 weeks, and you better home every time we got in the car. I'm hungry. Well, that's fine. You could be hungry until the next meal or snack. And we just got right back on it. The same for years. What was best for our family was that we would give them a snack as soon as they got in the car after daycare. That's because the daycare tended to not feed my son enough, who really needed calories. And he needed something the moment he got in the car, as soon as I got him. It wasn't ideal, but it was just kind of the way it had to be for our family. So we had a 5 p.m. snack for years. And just this year, based on my kids' school schedule, they're getting picked up from school at 1:30, and they just had lunch like an hour ago. They don't need a snack.
Yeah.
There has been major upset that we're not providing a snack. They're so hungry. They're starving to death. And it's 1:30. I said to my husband, we need to stand firm, because they're having to recircuit their trigger for when they're hungry. They're not actually hungry. This is purely a conditioning thing.
Yeah. I'm going to completely shift here. Okay. How would you suggest families handle things like kids sneaking food? Because it is something that is going to border on. Certainly, there might be times where there are actually, really big issues to address, and sometimes there may not be. But I think that it's a really easy place to then fall into big worries, but also worries about having the conversation, because, and talking about food in a way that might create more problems than what you already have right there.
And this can be really touchy. I actually have an IGTV. I think it might be going up tonight, now that I think about it, but where I'm actually talking about that. I find food sneaking is most commonly, now there can be all kinds of reasons for food sneaking, but as long as we're talking about a context where the family generally has enough food. We're talking about food trauma, like where a child didn't have enough food, they experienced intense hunger and starvation, that sort of thing. They're going to sneak food to help their body deal with that. Not talking about those, but the most common reasons that I see is they're hungry. That's the most common reason I see. They're hungry. They're not getting enough fat and protein during meals and snacks throughout the day. And so they're eating usually the most high calorie, biggest bang for the buck food that they can get, which is usually a highly processed snack. And parents flip out and they think, oh my gosh, they're stealing candy. But the reality is they're not sneaking candy. They are sneaking the highest calorie, quickest calorie thing that they can get. And that's because they're not getting enough fat and protein throughout the day. So for kids who are for those kids, like I never recommend low fat products for kids or anything else. Kids need fat and protein at meals and snacks, no matter what their body size. They need that to be healthy and to feel full. And so usually when kids get those things, they stop sneaking food. I had one mom who came to me and she said, talk to my pediatrician. We hired a behavioral specialist. We took my kid to a psychologist. We met with a dietitian. They had tried everything to get their 4-year-old to stop sneaking food. The kid would climb over baby gates, would bust through locks, would open the pantry door, go through, eat hard, plain, uncooked pasta. It was like, she it is pathological. And I thought to myself, she told me this story, and I said, to me, and who am I to say, because you've talked to all these people, but it sounds like he's hungry. And so I recommended that she feed him a high-calorie peanut butter milkshake. I have this banana milkshake. It's banana milk and peanut butter. It doesn't really have any ice cream in it or anything, but it tastes delicious. Yeah. And so I said, why don't you just try this? Feed this to him before bed and see what happens. So she tried that, came back to me 3 months later, and it had only happened twice in 3 months, and it used to happen every night. He was just hungry. He was just hungry, and his body was saying, you have to feed me, and I will do everything in my power to feed myself. There was nothing pathological at all. He was just hungry. So that's the hands down most common thing. The other thing I really commonly see is kids who are I lost my train of thought. They are being highly restricted by their parents. And the parent says, no candy. We don't eat candy. Our family doesn't eat junk food. We never eat those foods. Those foods are poison. The thing is, they've probably had candy and they tasted it and didn't taste poison to them. Yeah. So they feel like they're missing out. And so they'll go and sneak food. A mom came to me. She had an 11-year-old. She was devastated. She had just found out that her 11-year-old had spent all of her birthday money on junk food to be with her friends. And the mom said, I've just tried to tell her that other families can do things, but our family does not eat junk food. And I can't believe she did that. And her response to this was to take all the child's money away, to basically put her on full-time lockdown and to not let her be with her friends. Wow. And I thought, you know what, as a dietitian and as someone who kind of understands a little bit of the research in this area, the likelihood of her child getting better at sneaking and not getting caught and just learning that she needs to lead this double life in order to have some connection with her friends over some junk food, that's what's going to happen. And a mother doubling down on restriction is not what's going to happen. So what I recommend, if you find a child who's really obsessed with treats or sweets, bring them into the family. If you find their stash, bring it to the table. Hey, I know you have a stash, and I know I said candy was bad before, but you know what? I've changed my mind. I've learned a better way. And now as a family, we're going to have dessert with dinner every night. And we're just going to all have a piece of candy with dinner if we want. It'll be on the table. It's not going to be a big deal. We're not going to vilify it. We're just going to have it regularly, because having a piece of candy every night with your dinner is going to have a lot less health effects than binge eating large quantities of sugar by yourself in your bedroom, starting when you're 5.
And I see. I'm glad you kind of mentioned 4-year-old and 11-year-old, because I encounter it most in kids like later elementary, maybe middle school, and I find it's often, unfortunately, around the same time that a lot of kids put some weight on before they have a big growth spurt, especially the big pubertal growth spurt, and so I see a lot of families that are worried he's sneaking food, it looks like he's gotten bigger or something, and linking those two things together when there may just be a natural shift in the curves that are happening on our own.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Especially girls, puberty, they often gain weight. The hormones change. I mean, bodies change and grow depending on what they need. And parents often feel that they need to restrict their child's food intake to control their body size. But it's actually not our job as parents to control our child's body size. It's our job to provide balanced nutritious options, and to model healthful eating, model a healthy home environment, and to let our child's genetics play out, and to let them learn to listen to their body.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions. I feel like I could have 1,000 more questions. But, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think parents really should walk away from this conversation with, any real big favorite passion insights or something that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I always remind parents is their worth as a parent, their skill as a parent is not determined by what their child is eating. We often feel that it's a personal insult when our child doesn't eat something or they do eat something, or it's our victory if our child eats a new food. But the reality is that's their win. Our wins come from when we go through the hard work of making a balanced meal and putting that on the table. There's no reason to downplay how much work that is, especially when we're doing everything else. That's our win, and we should feel really accomplished and like we did something important. And then when we sit down and we eat that meal, that is equally important. That modeling is so important. And when we go through that tantrum and say, you know what, I know you really want a snack, but it's not snack time right now, and I'll do this puzzle with you while we're waiting for snack. When we go through those hard moments, they don't feel good.
Yeah.
It does not feel good to have a 2-year-old tantruming because they're hungry and they didn't eat their lunch and it's not snack time yet. That does not feel good, but that is a really deep win that will carry on in your child's health long term. And that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. This is pretty unrelated to everything we've talked about so far, but I know that you are a big fan of elderberry. And I am too. And I feel like I'd love to have the opportunity to talk about it for a minute with somebody else who's got some medical background that sees a use for it, while at the same time also recognizing that it's often oversold in terms of benefits. I started using it back in 2009 when H1N1 really first hit. And studies in Sweden or Switzerland or someplace first started to show that it had similar efficacy to Tamiflu at decreasing the duration of symptoms for the flu. Now that said, Tamiflu kind of stinks anyway because it only shortens it by up to a day, and that's what elderberry really shows too. But we were seeing some side effects with Tamiflu in some kids, and so a colleague and I started to use a lot of elderberry. But it certainly also has some myths that circulate around how effective it might be for things. But I asked mainly because I know that you do talk about it every now and then. And what are your thoughts on it?
I talked about it recently because there is so here's one thing that I just want to say. Elderberry does have contraindications, and very few people seem to acknowledge them or talk about them. So I always like to start a conversation by saying, if you have an immune system, an autoimmune condition, elderberry is contraindicated. It's also not been studied in children. And so anything that we're doing with elderberry with children is kind of an experiment. So you have to judge whether you're comfortable with that or not. And we also don't know how it interacts with something like COVID. Mm-hmm. So that's why I haven't been talking about it recently. Normally, I give it to my kids first sign of anything during the school, anything viral during the school year. And it's super helpful. I feel like I've actually gotten more work days and less my kids' sick days home from school because we started using it. We used to get sick every time we flew to see my parents, and now, we still get sick, but then we get better a lot faster. So it's really amazing. But we don't know because it increases the inflammatory response in the body. There is this theoretical idea that it could be involved in cytokine storms in the body. And so we don't really know how it would interact with a COVID situation. And because of that, I have a cupboard full of it, but I've gone really easy on using it just because we have that uncertainty, and I don't know if I really want to risk it myself.
Yeah. And so for those listening, Cytokine Storm is this idea, or it's a process by which the body's response to infection releases a lot of inflammation that might make some things worse. And it's a thought of part of what might make COVID infection really bad in those who get really bad. So we're the same. We have we have it on Amazon Subscribe and Save, right? And actually just canceled the last couple because we also currently have a cabinet full of it and have not been using it quite as much, even though it usually is part of our tea that we make when somebody is sick or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we usually go through bottles.
Yeah.
I used to think, oh my gosh, it's so expensive. And then I was like, wait, I'm not using as many vacation days. So worth it. But I completely agree. We're going conservative with this one just because COVID does seem to be pretty nasty. And I don't know. It's hard to kind of weigh these things sometimes, but I always like to bring that up when we talk about it.
Yeah. So you did touch on this a little while back, but you have a meal plan on the website. You have the Better Bites course. Who might want to check those out?
Yeah, so Real Easy Weekdays is a meal plan for busy families who aren't interested in some sort of radical diet, but they just want to do a little better. They want it to be easier to add fruits and veggies to meals and snacks. There's some homemade foods, there's some convenience foods, there's vegetarian options, there's an allergy supplement that goes along with it. But basically it's designed to increase your child's exposure to a variety of fruits and vegetables and to make meal planning and shopping a lot easier for you. Mm-hmm. My husband actually was able to pick it up. He had never done the meal planning and shopping in our family because it just, the way things worked out, it was better for me to do it. But when we went into quarantine, my husband said, hey, I want to give this a shot. He actually bought it on his own and next for one day. And there he is with Real Easy Weekdays. And he's planning the menu and the shopping list for the first time ever since we've had kids. And he was able to do it without asking me anything. So I know people who haven't been that involved in meal planning and shopping can just pick it up and use it. Better Bites is for families who have a picky eater and they want some help. They can't necessarily afford to work with a dietitian one-on-one, or they don't want to, they don't have the time or can't find one, but they have a picky eater and they really need an in-depth experience to help them learn to get their home feeding environment in the right place and then learn the advanced methods to work on them, on their child eating new foods. It's not a quick fix with picky eating. It's not something where I can say, oh, here's this one magical hack. It's not. It's daily food play. It's using food chaining. It's using taste challenges in a way that promotes safety and also challenges them to taste a food. It's all these advanced methods on top of that feeding environment. So for families who are really struggling with picky eating, that's a really big help to them.
Yeah. And I'll have those and your website and Instagram linked up in the show notes for the page and the description for the video below. Before we go, I do have one final question that I like to ask everybody who comes onto the show. And it's been pretty cool over the 4.5 years of the podcast to see all the different responses that come through. If you were to give parents 3 pieces of advice for raising happy, healthy, confident kids, what would you say?
You said 3 pieces of advice?
If you have them. I mean, I've had folks that have one, people that just kind of spill out and looks like they maybe had 5.
Great question. So I would say first, be there for your child, no matter if they're not eating or throwing a fit at the table. Be there. Be there, eat with them. The second is to eat with them. A family meal is one of the biggest bang for the buck activities you could ever do for nutrition, mental health, avoiding risky behaviors, the whole thing. It's just super, 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 super powerful. And the third would be, what's the third one? The third would be, let your kids know that you don't always get it right all the time, that you're learning. And you can say things like, yeah, we did that before and I've learned a new way to do it. And now we're going to do this new thing differently.
Yeah, I think those are great. You know, what I love most about all the content that you share is that there's a kind wisdom that permeates through it all, and that you let families know that what they're doing is okay, that they can feel confident and they can feel reassured that they're not breaking their kids forever. while at the same time helping to guide them towards making healthier choices. It's what I try to do, and I'm really, really thankful and grateful that you are out there doing the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for doing that and for being here and sharing that kind wisdom with everybody today.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for your kind words. It was such a great conversation and so wonderful to be here today.